spoiled, right? So just wanted to share a little bit of housekeeping as we are getting started. So we've got a full agenda today, so I know we want to dive right in. We've got a couple. Do you want to walk through the quorum, or
I'll do the agenda? You were going to say nice things about Mr. Field.
Oh, okay. I don't have my script.
Heather,
I can.
We don't need a
sure.
Yeah, well, yes, we did. I will.
Goodness.
So let me just say,
Yeah.
I respected and admired Danfield so much that this morning I let him cut in front of me while he was pulling out of the gas station and we were driving into work this morning. But I just want to say how much I just appreciate Dan's leadership over the last 2 years, stepping into a leadership position at the county for a department that had an incredible amount of responsibility, incredible amount of work, of expectations. And he, and this was a real opportunity that he stepped into because of his desire to give back to this community that he's loved, that he's worked in for so many years. And he really leaned into Multnomah County and the work, but especially the work of the Joint Office, now the Human Services Department, and provided incredible leadership. He really listened to, I think, understood the perspective of the employees, of the providers. I really appreciate the partnership that he and I did with several meetings with providers early on that helped, that I think helps drive some immediate changes in terms of contracting, in terms of communication, in terms of, listening to what the providers needed, and the stability and then the performance that has been a result of his leadership and the leadership team that he has built up, including Anna and so many others, has just been incredible. So Dan, I want to thank you so much for your work over the last 2 years. I'm going to wish you a great retirement, but we are, we have a clear map. We have the HRAP plan. We have an IGA with the city. We've got a full team, and we are providing more services and more programs than ever before in Multnomah County, in large part because of him and the incredible employees that he leads. So thank you.
Yes, we'll be missed. Okay, I'll jump now to the agenda. So as we start today's agenda, we just wanted to remind you of some of the key responsibilities for this committee as outlined in the IGA. We'll be bringing you several updates and discussions in line with these responsibilities. So first, we'll monitor progress toward our plan goal focused on equitably sheltering or housing people who are overrepresented within the broader population of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness. Specifically, you'll hear updates on strategies and program implementation that HSD is advancing. And this is all based on this prior committee's direction to just figure it out, go forth, take action. So we'll report on some of those initial actions today. And then next, we'll share information to help you monitor progress toward our goal to increase the percentage of people exiting adult shelters to permanent housing. Our performance on this measure, as you know, has been decreasing rather than improving. So our discussion has a couple of parts, asking you to consider supplemental information that can help us better understand some of the nuance of this measure, sharing promising directions for shifting this measure to help you set alignment, to help you set aligned strategy and investment, and then in beginning to think about the impacts of adding from additional overnight shelter capacity to this measure. And this is just a good example. I want to bridge back to the previous meeting because we had a little debate around, when I asked y'all, we showed you an action item and we were going to break out the action items. And I was like, that's my job. And y'all were like, but is that our job? Well, this is your job. When we talk about these measures, particularly measure 3, I can't change a measure, how we measure it, what data we pull into it without your clear direction and support. And we actually can't officially change a measure without absent a vote by the 2 governing bodies. So know that we need, in the context of measure 3 specifically, we need clear direction. And then finally, we will round out the meeting with 2 discussions on strategy for program development and alignment, continued conversation about how to reduce shelter stay length, and then an update on the local and federal landscape regarding housing production. So with that, I will kick it over to Deputy Director Ryan Tybert.
Good morning, everybody. Really glad to be here with you again. My name is Ryan Dybert. I use he, him pronouns, and I am the Deputy Director here with the Homelessness Response System. I'm going to tee up that discussion around Measure 2 first, because it seems like my role relative to this whole endeavor is to present data. I actually just turned up a video of me presenting data at a work session of City Council 9 years ago. I'm like, oh my. All right, so just to help orient you, or rather reorient you to Measure 2, I know we've talked about this a lot. Measure 2 looks at the number or the percentage of people who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness across our community by race, ethnicity, age, and sets a goal for our overall initiative that the folks that we are sheltering or housing will be sheltered or housed in roughly the same percentages, right? So it is a measure of whether we're equitably achieving our outcomes. If you'll go to the next slide, this is a visual representation, particularly the one on the far left. This is how we've looked at this measure in each of our quarterly reports prior to now. So we look at the number of folks who are sheltered or housed. This looks specifically at the percentage of people who are sheltered or housed who are Black, African American, or African. The blue bar represents the actual percentage of folks who were sheltered or housed during that reporting period. The gray bar behind it shows what our goal would be. So if we were if we were at or above that gray bar, we would be meeting our goal. This for Black, African American, and African folks, we've consistently been about 2.5 percentage points below meeting that goal. So we did some work, especially into this last quarterly report, to try to understand in a little more detail what was happening with that measure. And then between the Homeless Services Department and our team at the Homelessness Response System, we had some deeper engagement with providers and community leaders to get even more a more detailed understanding. But just looking at the data side of it, when you split out those who were sheltered but not yet housed versus those who housed, you see that this disparity for Black and African American folks is really significantly driven by a disparity in access to shelter. So we're actually exceeding the goal when you look at folks who are accessing housing, but we're significantly below the goal for folks who are accessing shelter. So I think that's what I needed to cover.
Mm-hmm. Please,
Great.
Robin.
Thanks.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Robin Johnson. I'm a policy advisor on the homelessness response team, and in partnership with Emily and the Homeless Services Department practicing, we led some engagement with community culturally specific providers for the Black, African American, and African community. And as we've looked into the data at the direction of the SOC, we heard some things that informed these recommendations, and I'm just going to go through the recommendations really quickly. So community asked for increase in rent assistance and housing placement dollars, really looking at those upstream housing stabilization so that folks don't move into homelessness. And one of the things that we heard from community is that for folks who are in shelter, if a Black or African American person goes to a dominant culture organization, that the culturally specific organizations have to advocate harder for them to get housing placement dollars. And so that's the portion of this recommendation that is really asking us to put more dollars through culturally specific organizations and really look at contracting with a wider variety of partners across the community who are doing culturally specific work. Secondly, investing in upstream stabilization dollars. And so really that culturally Black and African American folks don't go to shelter. We heard from community that shelter is barely a step up from the streets, but they double up and they are really having to spend 1 or 2 nights with a family member or stay as long as they can. And so couch surfing is really culturally what happens. And so really looking at providing some flexible dollars to individuals to help them contribute to their friends and family who are helping to house them.
Questions at all? Chair, how do you want to go through?
Why don't we let them get
Yeah.
through the talking about this measure and then we'll go to questions.
Great, thank you so much, Chair. So additionally, increasing the accountability among current shelter providers to really increase access to shelter for Black, African American, and African folks. And really, community asked that they wanted to see people who looked like them working in the shelters and organizations that serve them well to be providing those services, and cited anti-Blackness and racism as a prevalent, as extremely prevalent sort of in the shelter space and in the organizations that help them get into shelter. And then lastly, our recommendation is continued engagement between HRS and HSD. We did this engagement really quickly. We sort of did it on a dominant culture timeline, and we really need to pivot to what community was asking for, which is this is a much longer conversation to really move the needle on housing stability for Black, African American, and African folks, and continuing to refine our system to meet the needs of everyone who is walking through the door equitably. And so I'll stop there and just appreciate the work of all colleagues, appreciate the direction of this team, and reciprocity is our obligation. And so I'm really happy to be in this work with you all. So thank you. Emily?
Good morning. Are we doing questions now?
Okay. Finish up with
Yeah.
the 2 contract changes, and then we'll open it to questions.
Good morning. My name is Emily. I use she and her pronouns. I'm the equity manager at the Homeless Services Department. So as the recommendations reference, it's really important to us that the communities who are prioritized in the plan and culturally specific providers who serve them are included in the shaping of our services and our plans to serve them. And also a deeper and broader understanding is needed to ensure that the work that we're serving the community is culturally informed and responsive. So I think we can see in these recommendations that the 2 major questions that we're going to continue to investigate are how do we make our shelter system more culturally responsive, specific, and informed? And also what are the most effective and culturally responsive, specific, and informed sheltering models for the Black, African American, and African communities? So we talked about our dashboards at the May Steering and Oversight Committee, but this will help us to be able to monitor who's being served both at the system and provider level, which is a valuable tool for helping us support accountability to equitable service delivery. We also require equity work plans from all of our providers, and our improved monitoring and support of those work plans can support accountability to cultural responsiveness for all of our providers. So the Homeless Services Department has received and approved 2 very well-timed proposals from 2 of our culturally specific providers who serve Black, African American, and African communities, which are aligned with these recommendations and are giving us the opportunity to immediately invest in these recommended strategies, demonstrate flexibility, and fund solutions to homelessness that are informed by the expertise of our culturally specific providers. So just a summary of the proposals. We are supporting Urban League in repurposing 45 beds in our adult shelter system to a 3-pronged approach of motel vouchers, community building day services, and culturally specific in-reach and housing placement. This is a more culturally responsive sheltering strategy, which is consistent with the recommendations. It's also important to note that the culturally specific in-reach will serve people across our shelter system, and so that will enhance the culturally responsive nature of the shelter system as a whole. And then Africa House is repurposing 25 planned youth shelter beds and replacing those with day services, outreach, connection to community resources, client assistance, and motel vouchers or shelter referrals. Both of these proposals will be delivered by culturally specific providers, are informed by cultural expertise, and are aligned with the most culturally responsive sheltering strategies that are recommended by this engagement. So we're just really excited for the opportunity to immediately implement some of these recommendations, and the next step to that implementation will hopefully include the revision of metrics in the HREP 2.0 conversation that y'all will have to better reflect and measure the impacts of these culturally informed sheltering strategies. And this engagement strategy around Measure 2 in general, I think, is a key example of how the Homeless Response System and the Steering and Oversight Committee has helped us to get feedback and make adjustments to better meet those shared goals.
Commissioner, I'm so sorry, Counselor Zimmerman.
Take it away, Shannon. Okay, thanks. So these recommendations in measure two, when we say who develops recommendations, I guess that's my question. Where are these developed? Who is putting their name to we are recommending this?
Through the engagement that we did uh, with individuals and organizations who do culturally specific work.
And a little context on that is that we spoke with community.
I would love like real words and names because
Okay.
like talking about the community is very broad and it's kind of used as a cover word sometimes. I think I need some roots and here's why. Because I don't want to gloss over the second bullet, which is I think you said we want to pay people for who are taking in couch surfing. And I'm just trying to understand why there is so much emphasis on this in this presentation. Couple things. I think couch surfing is something that we intrinsically understand as a part of a lot of people's stories and journeys through different aspects of life. It's not relevant to just one race or one demographic, but it's also, I'm not sure very many members of the public voted for SHS dollars because of couch surfing. I think we voted for street-based issues. And so I don't think that the connective tissue for why this is coming off the page, because this seems like a pretty significant gloss over of many points that got presented, but I'm trying to understand if I'm catching this bullet wrong, please take the opportunity to correct me. But if we could know like which organizations are saying this is the metric, this is the way, instead of just saying community, and why do we think that this is appropriate use of of government dollars?
So we spoke, we had about 8 engagement sessions, both with culturally specific organizations, SEI, Urban League, and then we met with the Equity Advisory Committee for the Homeless Services Department, which is made up of culturally specific and culturally responsive providers, but most importantly, people of color that provide these services to other Black and African American and African folks in community. Unwaveringly, we heard 2 things in every one of the engagements. One, and I would say save for the engagement with our dominant culture shelter providers, because there was only one culturally specific Black and African American provider there. And so we heard 2 things unwaveringly. One, anti-Blackness and racism in the shelter system was a driver of the low utilization of shelter by Black and African American and African people. 2, that culturally Black and African American people do not go to shelter because the experience, their experience is similar to over policing, over correcting for their behavior.
Yeah.
So let me just finish. The other thing that I'm so sorry, the other piece that we heard is that culturally Black and African American people do not go to shelter for those reasons, and they double up because that is what their community does. And so I'm going to stop there because what I can do is retell the story of what I heard in community. What I cannot do is speak for the Black and African American community in this space. So I'm just going to stop there.
So I think if I could, I do think that a lot of folks in the Pop B for SHS, I think that's where couch surfing comes in, and it was intentionally written into the SHS measure. It's a smaller proportion of who should be served, and it for sure isn't just, it's a lot of communities of color who experience this differently. I think I would say it's not just SHS that goes into this work either, and so there's general fund dollars that we have, there's other funding sources, and this has long been an issue in homeless services where I actually know a number of organizations that if I've housed somebody and they've got somebody then couch surfing and they might violate their lease because of guest policies, that we've tried to house that other person so there aren't lease violations. And that's what I think you all are getting at, if that's more
Well, that's not what
clarifying.
was said, Commissioner. What was said is we want to pay the people who are taking them in, and I think that's different. And frankly, I'm just like, the idea that some shelters don't serve all members of our community, I accept that 100%. They don't do it well. I accept that. And so why wouldn't we target our dollars to create a shelter system that does do that versus a payment structure? And I'm there seems to continue to be a little bit of a lost aspect with, I'm trying to understand where, I'm gonna hold my comments. I don't know the emphasis and continue why we wouldn't say, let's find a way to fund shelters that meet a need.
Because the community has said that's not the right intervention for us. And it's not just culturally specific organizations. I had conversations with Black leaders as well. And it has just been, we've had shelters that were culturally specific, and while they functioned and people were able to access them, it also wasn't the preferred method, and it's a lot of money. And so
Preferred method for
I'm,
anybody, right?
let me finish. What we're saying in our community is, InReach works. Let us have money to be a mobile team that goes into shelters and make sure we can help house Black folks out of them. And let's find ways to invest. I think we can talk about what do we mean and what do we want to see in addressing any doubled up. This is a recommendation that we can give feedback on. And so if the investing in, like, giving dollars to the person who's housing the couch surfer isn't what makes sense for you, then let's talk about what does, because I do think the idea of housing that person is something that makes a lot of sense, and that may get at where you have some consternation with this.
No, that I appreciate. What I don't appreciate, and this has happened now a couple of times, is being explained by a staff member why the recommendations are gospel. This happened in our council to one of my counselors who got explained about how we gather data related to race and demographics by the one Black lady on my council. And so I'm just rejecting this idea that a staffer is going to get to do that. These are developed in community, but they have to be described as it relates to the whole plan. And this idea that because I say it from a staff perspective, I'm going to argue and say, how dare you even question it, kind of starts this whole conversation off in a way that is not as productive. And frankly, our dialogue is always, frankly, I find a lot more healthy. And I would just encourage us to really think about how this group is going to get used, because we continue to start off in this place and it's not helpful. I appreciate, frankly, Commissioner, the way you approach this conversation are able to help me gain understanding, understand some of the nuance to it versus just here's the dogmatic thing, you must accept it. I've never had you say that to me, and I appreciate that a lot. So I just want to, I'm going to back up from my question now and just kind of allow this to keep going. But there are some things that just get said in these recommendations when we get these staff presentations, and it doesn't seem like there's any room for us to say, is this the right path? Do we want this to happen? Is this what we're looking? And this SOC has a role, or it doesn't. And I don't think the role is rubber stamping.
And to be clear, Counselor, we're presenting that the Steering and Oversight Committee asked staff to engage in this outreach to summarize the recommendations and bring them back for your review, consideration, and discussion. So that's the role that staff are playing in this space.
And you do that great, Ryan. I mean that.
So let me also say that, you know, we're channeling what we are told and bridging it to the actions that we are taking. So I think the questions, I welcome questions, not questioning what we've heard and are sharing back, but rather do the actions that HSD is taking with these two contracted provider to change how we are using those funds. Is that in line with what we heard, and does it move the dial forward? I think so. But if there is disagreement around that, now is the time to tell us in response to the actions we are taking.
If I add one more thing, that we did provide the full memo at our last meeting, which has a fair amount of additional context. And so I would invite anyone to, again, pivot back to that document, and very happy to provide a briefing on it, given that I led the work. And so really appreciate your comments about how you want to, how and from who you want to hear. And I'm really leaning into the role that I was asked to do by the homeless response system. So thank you so much for your feedback on the work, Counselor.
And I do think it would be helpful to get more specific about what invest in upstream stabilization means and what activities you all are talking about, so that that's body.
My last question is, does this second bullet apply to all demographics? Meaning if we find that other racial demographics, other cultures also have, which I would say couch surfing exists in a lot of cultures and a lot of age groups and a lot of families and a lot of friend groups. Would this apply, and is this being recommended to apply across the city, across the county's entire system, or only focused in this demographic?
And Counselor, with that, I feel like the takeaway that I hear from you is you're really asking a rent assistance policy question. Like, how does rent assistance work in that particular scenario for any given individual? And so that is something that we can take back and work on.
Thanks.
Absolutely. All right, are we ready?
Any other questions? All right, thank you.
Moving on to number 3, and given the time, I'm gonna have to be a little hard, and every section is gonna be in the back a little bit. So here we go, Mr. Doug.
I will do what I can. Measure, if you'll, yeah, perfect. Measure 3 is another ATRAP goal that we've discussed in some detail. And in fact, a lot of the information that I'm going to share today is a little bit of a repeat for the elected officials in the room of some of the information that we shared at the joint session. But I did want to share that here so that it can support some discussion and that we have level setting for all of the members of the committee as well. So again, we're trying to support that discussion for the committee around your responsibilities to identify and monitor key performance indicators that we agreed to within the IGA, and then to align resources and strategies to help move the needle on those KPIs. This goal looks to increase the percentage of people exiting adult shelter into housing. That's the blue bar in this graph. And it from a pre-ATRAP baseline of 26%, which is the gray dotted line, to a goal of 41% of adults exiting shelter to housing. That's the red dotted line that you see there. So for the full period that we've reported on this measure under ATRAP, we've seen quarter-over-quarter decreases in this measure, such that in the 12 months ending in March 2025, only 19% of people exiting adult shelter were recorded as exiting to housing. So I want to be really candid that this measure is not perfect. We're going to talk about some of the ways that it has some challenges, especially relative to your committee responsibilities to think about how we track our progress. And then our colleagues at the Homeless Services Department have done some really great work in the past couple of months to help us better understand what's actually happening with this measure, and more importantly, what we can do to improve system performance around it. So like in more human terms, how we can get more people into housing. So let's see, throughout the analysis, just to say, throughout the presentation, I'm going to share some analysis that Doc Ramblings, who's one of the senior research and evaluation analysts at the Homeless Services Department, put together. So I genuinely appreciate Doc's really quick, thoughtful and careful work. I'm presenting it today, but it's his work. I'll encourage any colleagues from the Homeless Services Department to hop in if I misrepresented it in any way. So if you'll go to the next slide, thank you, I already did. If you take nothing else away from what I'm going to cover with you today, it would be these two bottom lines. If we don't have other supplemental data, it's really difficult to understand why this measure is shifting and how to programmatically to shift it closer to our goal. So we'll talk about how we can supplement the information. And then the second bottom line here is if we continue to expand shelter, which is one of our planned goals, without also increasing housing placement resources for people in shelter, this measure is going to continue to go down. And I'll show you how that works. And we can talk about some of how we want to address that moving forward. So on the next slide, this takes on the first graph that I showed you, it had just the percentages of adults exiting shelter. Those percentages carry over here. They're listed above the bar. So those are the percentages that you saw in the prior graph. But this shows you the actual number of people who exited adult shelters to housing. That's the dark blue section. And then those who exited to any other setting, which is the light blue bar. So a couple of things to note here. So if you look at the quarter ending in September of 2024, so that's the middle of those bars in this graph. That was the first quarter where we saw a decrease in the percentage. So we saw a decrease in the percentage, but there were actually more people who were housed than in the prior reporting period. So in other words, we had more people housed, but the percentage of people housed went down because more people exited shelter total. Another place where you see that is if you look at the last bar on your far right and the first bar on your far left, you've got, in our last reporting period, we had 1,190 people who exited shelter into housing, and that was 19% of everyone who exited shelter. That's more people who exited a year ago at the beginning of this, 1,115. But there were fewer people exiting housing or exiting shelter total, so the percentage was higher, right? So you get the idea. Looking at the percentage alone can give you an incomplete picture because we can have more people who are actually being housed, but it looks like a lower percent. You go to the next slide. Couple of other challenges with this measure. This data is all self-reported by folks who are leaving shelter, and it's recorded by shelter workers as this is where I understand this person to be going when they leave shelter. So this isn't augmented by looking to see if somebody exits a shelter, do we subsequently see them entering a housing program, for instance. And then another thing to keep in mind is you see shifts in this percentage based on on events that occur more broadly in our system. For instance, when we close a shelter and move folks into another shelter space, all of those folks are exited from that shelter. It causes a spike in our exits within that quarter. So, for instance, when Barber and Greyhound both closed and folks moved to other shelter spaces, those folks were all exited, and they were exited to homelessness if they moved to another shelter space. So you can get the numbers skewed by individual events like that. I talked at a system level, you can have more people exiting permanent housing and still get lower exit rates or percentages. But at the program level, you also see that some of our shelters with lower rates may be actually exiting more people than some of our shelters with higher rates because they serve fewer people overall. And I'll show you a graph to walk you through this. Okay, next slide, if you will. So despite the concerns around the measure, it does tell us some important things. We can confirm that shelter exits to permanent housing have declined over the last 9 months. And at the system level, we can see that we're exiting fewer total people to housing from shelter, even though we have more shelter beds operating. So in other words, the needle's moving downward. I talked through some of the technical reasons the needle's moving downward, just the math of the percentages. But Doc also did some really great work in conversation directly with shelter providers and program staff to understand at a ground level a little more about why that needle's moving downward. And conversely, it helps us understand what we can do from a system perspective to start moving it in the other direction. So at the highest level, what Doc heard was that the primary issues impacting shelter programs' ability to place people into permanent housing include the lack of housing placement options. There's just not enough available housing. Under-resourced shelters, including reduced placement funding over the past couple of years. And I'll talk to each of these in some detail. Challenges using rapid rehousing as a particular housing model, and then some additional participant barriers. So to talk a little in detail about the lack of housing placement options, this continues to be the biggest barrier for providers. We're going to talk about this toward the end of our agenda when we talk about some of the housing production strategies and some of the work that's happening both at federal and local level. But without subsidies, there are very few housing opportunities that are available for people who have incomes below 30% of the median family income. So as a result, providers are supporting households for longer periods of time, which results in fewer households getting served overall. And then we're also seeing that there's a need for transfer between rental units that may be impeding our ability to place new folks. So in other words, we're spending system resources helping people retain their housing by moving them to other more viable housing. And that means there are fewer folks that we can place from shelter into housing. So on the next slide, to talk a little bit about the under-resourced shelters. Not all providers and programs have the same level of case management, staffing, placement funding, other housing-related resources. So existing shelters need to be supported with appropriate funding in order to become more efficient at exiting people to permanent housing. Case management, rental assistance are the two most vital supports consistently that shelter providers need in order to increase that flow out of shelter and into permanent housing. We've also seen that limited client assistance funds in shelters have required some providers to take a more targeted approach where they're only making those services, the housing placement services, available to select portions of shelter guests. Doc actually tried to get a sense in like numbers of people and in budget of what that gap, what the scale of the overall resource gap looks like, and I'll get at that in one of our slides coming up. Next slide. We talked about the barrier that providers identified around reduced funding for housing placements. Specifically, we've had challenges with limited client assistance funds as early as 2023 when COVID era assistance started to wind down. But the trend really continued into 2024, where we were seeing demand for rent assistance going up among providers and available rent assistance going down. So the second half of 2024 especially showed an improvement in placement out of shelter, but it became harder to move folks out as voucher programs like Oregon All In and Housing Multnomah Now have dwindled. So those were each funded with one-time resources at the state and the local level. As that housing placement money goes away, our ability to place folks in housing also declines. We're also seeing that the amount of money spent per household to get folks into housing is going up as housing costs continue to rise and folks come with additional barriers. If you'll go to the next slide, just to illustrate this a little bit, this slide is a little complicated, but it shows number of people who exited shelter to permanent housing, and it's split out by shelter type. So the highest volume overall, for instance, up top is out of our congregate shelters. But you see both, particularly if you look at the blue line, which focuses on the TAS and SRV sites that we operate as alternative shelter sites, those were heavily dependent on those one-time state and local resources to place folks into housing. When those resources went away, the number of people that they could move out of those shelters dropped off really precipitously. So you see that drop in the blue line. You see a similar effect for folks out of other congregate shelter spaces, but I think it's most pronounced there if you look at that blue line. So just wanted to illustrate that piece. We heard from providers that rapid rehousing is often the model that's used to move folks from shelter back into housing. It's usually short-term rent assistance for a limited period of time. It's a really important intervention. It allows for a person-centered approach. It's really flexible. But because it's short-term and time limited, many people end up needing longer-term subsidies. And it's not always a good fit for everybody served in shelter, especially folks with more acute needs. And also what we've seen is that the amount per household that's budgeted for rapid rehousing isn't holding up as costs are increasing in the housing market. And then the last slide here, we also heard from providers additional barriers to housing that are presented for individual folks in shelter. We're seeing added costs and time and complexity for shelter providers who are having to address acute behavioral health issues in shelter contexts because behavioral health services are not available in community as significantly as they need to be. We're seeing folks with larger property debt or back rent who are having to pay that before landlords will move them to housing. And then without that with the lack of resource that we have to help move people from shelter, we're also seeing increased lengths of stay at some shelter programs and a lack of engagement by some shelter participants. So, and I know we'll talk about that at more length coming up. Okay, so next slide. This is that gap. So we asked Doc to try to get a handle on if we were going to try to, so we have a goal to increase from 26% of adults exiting shelter to 41% of adults exiting shelter to housing. That gap is about 1,400 people. So we were able to help move about 1,200 people from shelter into permanent housing over the last year. You would need to move 1,400 additional people in order to be at 41% and meet our goal. If you look at the average cost per of providing the rent assistance and the housing placement services to folks to actually do that, it's about $13,000 per household is what it's currently budgeted at or contracted at. And what we've heard from providers is it needs to be more than that, actually, based on the higher costs, closer to $22,000. So that 1,400 person gap equates to about an $18 to $31 million gap to be able to actually move to meet that goal. So just some real numbers around that. And then one last nuanced piece, great, that I want to talk about before we transition to a discussion, because it's another point of discussion. So none of our reporting to date, none of what you saw up there has included the 200 new overnight only shelter beds that opened in the past year. So data collection is required at those overnight only shelters. But as with most new providers who are standing up brand new programs, it takes a while to get your feet under you and get to complete data collection to where you're routinely collecting high quality complete data. We don't have that, so we've been intentionally excluding that data set from what we've been presenting here. So currently the Homeless Service Department is working with Portland Solutions leadership and with the Salvation Army to get to better data quality in those overnight only shelters. But at a minimum, we know that almost 1,200 people accessed those 200 shelter beds in the first 3 months of this calendar year. 800 of those 1,200 hadn't accessed other shelters looking back to the beginning of this fiscal year. So that's good, right? We're getting more people inside, but it's also a fair amount of turnover. So 1,200 people moving through 200 beds. And we don't yet have good data on where folks went when they exited. So again, we'll follow up on this and continue to move it through. But in our discussion, I'm going to ask you to think about some of the implications of adding people served in these overnight only shelters and the other ones that are going to be coming online in the next few months to reporting in this specific measure. And let me give you just a quick picture of how that might impact. This next slide separates this. These are looking at the rates of housing out of our motel-based shelters. The bottom line is our motel-based shelters, when you include, there's a subset of motel shelters that the health department uses for voluntary isolation when people have infectious diseases and can't be in congregate shelter spaces. So they have no housing focus. They're just to get people safely isolated for a while, and then folks exit. So they don't have a housing focus. When you include them in motel shelters overall, the rate of placement out of shelter hovers around 20%. When you exclude those voluntary isolation motels that don't have the housing focus, the percentage of exits from motel shelters goes up significantly to a little above 40%, right? So you can get some idea that as we start to incorporate overnight only shelters, if they don't have a specific housing focus, they will likely similarly skew our system numbers downward like that. So if we go to the last slide, this is trying to set up the rest of our time on this point for discussion. So a couple of things that I want to put out there for you to talk about. So one, this committee has a role in identifying and monitoring KPIs. So in that particular role, I'll tell you, we assume we're going to have to revise this KPI as we move forward into HRAP 2.0. But in the meantime, we think we need to supplement it with additional data. At a minimum, we need to not just be giving you the percentage, but also be giving you total numbers of people who are exiting, so you can at least monitor that. I'm hoping as part of the discussion, though, you can tell us other things that you're interested in trying to know and follow to be able to track on this measure. We also think we're going to need in future reporting to separate what the system looks like with our overnight only shelters in the mix on this measure and excluded from this mix. So show you both pictures so that you can understand what's going on across the system with that included and not. And then, so those are some of the discussion points that I will hope you'll dig into around the KPI and how we monitor this. And then on the strategy and resource alignment role, which this committee has, it is an elephant in the room. It's that gap of 1,400 folks comes with a price tag of about $18 to $30 million in additional housing placement assistance that it would take to meet that goal. So as we're talking across jurisdictions about and across sectors about aligning resources to better meet the goals, that's a piece that is, I think, ripe for discussion here. That's where I stop in the discussion with this.
Thank you, Ryan. This was really important information. And I just want to say, I appreciate tying that dollar amount to the need that we have to reach these goals and to really have a clear picture of what's needed to actively use shelters to get people moved into housing. That's something that I've been asking for a while. So it's great to see it. And so that we have a sense of how our investments across the continuum make a difference in different ways. So I'm going to open up for any questions around the data.
I'm trying to sit back, but I have.
No, just
Just wait. So a couple of things that pop for me is one, the numbers are decreasing as well. So I think that even having both, we're clearly in a situation where the resource isn't there.
Yep.
I think I mentioned this at our joint session, but I do also think we should be measuring other positive exits.
Yeah.
Exit to a recovery program is a good exit from shelter, and that's not being captured here. I think we then need a measure on exits to permanent housing from recovery housing to make sure that we're not kind of losing sight of that flow through there too. And those were some of the things that kind of popped for me. I think the other positive exit that we may not capture is like living with family and friends. And we capture it, we collect the data, but I don't think that shows up in how we look at this measure.
If folks are telling us they're moving in with family and friends and they're able to stay there permanently, they would show up the way we're measuring it right now. But if they say, yeah, but I don't know if I can stay there forever, they wouldn't show up. So
Okay.
just a nuance. And you reminded me of a piece that I missed in this. So in talking about other positive exits, two things. One is what we see is there's actually a lot of movement with folks exiting one shelter into another shelter, where, like, for instance, from a congregate shelter into a motel shelter, where they may have more tailored case management, more access to housing placement resources, and then they move into housing. So not every exit from one shelter into another shelter is necessarily a negative exit. The other piece that we're missing by just looking at exits from shelter is that about 4,000 people moved into permanent housing in the last year, and only about 20% of those folks moved from shelter into permanent housing. So from a system perspective, you're not seeing that other movement of folks from youth family systems. You're also not seeing the movement of folks from street directly into housing placement. So
I definitely, I don't know if this is part of the 2.0 and leading up to that, but I think this could be expanded to capture those things that we know are more positive exits. And now that we have the flow through data and that inflow and outflow dashboard, I think there's better ways to talk about that people's journey. And then the other thing I will say is this is another part of what I think we need to talk about as a county and city in, do we resource shelters specifically to do housing placement, or should we be looking at more in-reach teams that are serving across the system so that no matter what shelter you go into, you have access to housing placement support, as opposed to the person having to move to a certain place to get that support. How do we think about the support going mobile? And I don't have an answer to it. I just think it's a conversation we should have before we get too far into, I know we're not done 26 budget yet, but I feel like 27 is gonna roll right in. And I think we need to have that conversation.
You know what, one of the things that when I'm talking to providers often is recovery shelter. And that with our focus on low barrier shelter, which certainly helps a population, is recovery shelter is important because as we release somebody from post detox, Central City Concern will tell you often, I think it's 20%, but it used to be above 50%, they were releasing to homelessness. And so we spend all that time and money to stabilize somebody. And then you release them back to that environment where, you know, drugs and or an unhealthy environment is prevalent. I've been hearing more and more about having more services or replacing the gap, not just shelters, right? Not just come as you are shelters, but having those requirements. And, you know, Tony Burnell calls it abstinence shelter. So it doesn't mean you're in recovery. It just means that you're going to come to a place that is and or requires, you have to be clean, if you will, right? So I just think we need to look at the table. Transitional housing used to be funded in a more robust fashion by HUD. And we've really focused on housing first and housing and or shelter. And I think that's fine, but I think we need to have a more comprehensive and start adding back some of those missing links or not as invested links, because TPI still has their recovery shelter. But since 2017, they've only added low barrier shelter. And I think we hear that. We really do need to look at that continuum as it looks like and meeting a person where they're at. Never really having somebody in recovery with somebody who's actively using. It's just not a healthy outcome, if you will. And then, you know, and we want to flip that exit to homelessness at 40% and exit to permanent housing at 20. The goal is to flip that, but knowing where that person is, and it's a good discussion to have.
If you don't mind, I'll just validate that word. I feel just in the past 6 months, I've heard a lot more of that request, particularly even this week when Sky and I were at Providence and Legacy, the patients there, some of which that I met with, where they really want that sort of that sober place. And then just to bridge to housing placement for a second, we'll get this later, but on our housing connector list of available apartments, there's 100 sober beds. So the living bed on there. So that's placement dollars. So like we do have some avenues there, but yeah, there is this request, particularly even for respite care beds, that some of them be sober. And so we're going to work with CCC on it. But yeah, I just want to validate that we're hearing that more and more.
I'm sorry, one thing I want us to be mindful of is transitional recovery housing is not housing, it's not permanent. And so when we're saying sober housing, like I want to make sure those are actual, you can stay here for as long as you choose, as opposed to this is a time limited stay.
The 100 beds I'm talking about is permanent.
Great.
Yeah.
No, you're fine. I think that as you think about adjusting the KPI, I think part of the point was to make sure that we're reflecting a system and to keep in balance the shelter capacity that we are supporting people into housing, whatever that looks like. So Commissioner Singleton's list of positive exits is great, but I wouldn't throw out the proportionality of it, because I think that's an important reflection that we actually have a system, which is part of what we're here to build. And then I think on your sort of honest assessments about the cost that it will take to place folks, I think we have to be really honest about that right now. I think we've seen costs accelerate for service providers. I think that's a thing we need to do with and for the community, is to say, like, what can we actually do that can keep our housing service providers in business, that they can sustain. And so I'd be really curious about the implementation committee's perspective on that as we go forward. But I just think it's important to be realistic as we go on in this.
Counselor Zimmerman?
Thanks. On the challenges with this measure, one of the things that says impacted by other factors, and you put a bullet point about shelter closing. I I recognize that, and I guess it pains me a little bit just relative to all of our FY 26 budget conversations. With last year's community sheltering plan, we'd set a goal at the county level of 1,000 shelter beds. I think we reduced that to 872. But watching your budget work session yesterday, I'm a little concerned with, I know there was a discussion, Commissioner Singleton, about closing some that would take us down to 600 in that. And I know that it sounds like that shelter, or those shelters that you're targeting are closing eventually anyway, but talking about doing it earlier, I guess I want to use this as an opportunity of like, shelter closing is being noted. We know that shelters close occasionally based on site needs, et cetera, but I really hope we're not accelerating a further decrease away from the 1,000-bed goal, because the next bullet point on this is it does not clearly measure improvements. And I would also say one of the improvements that doesn't get talked about sometimes in these types of rooms is the improvement on the street, which does not solve homelessness, and I recognize that, but for a grand number of our folks in the public, it is a tangible and experiential improvement about who is or who is not, or how much we see sleeping on the streets or not. So I tie those together, noting that I don't think anybody in this room, and frankly, I don't think anybody in the city thinks that shelter, anybody knowledgeable anyway, thinks shelter is the positive thing we're going for. But I think there's an acceptance of, from the worst situation to the best being permanently housed, there are some interim steps along the way. And so I think we've seen improvements on the streets. And I think that is because we emphasized shelter a lot more this last 18 to 24 months than I've seen. So I just want to note that from our perspective and from sitting at the city, a further reduction of the community sheltering plan, I think, exacerbates some of the challenges with this and within this measure as well.
And I just want to be very clear that the budget amendments that I'm moving rely on some state funds, about $5 million to be able to fully fund those shelters with the one-time only to have expiring leases. So the goal is not to close them early. We're just kind of wrestling with how do we fill some of the different gaps that we have. So I fully appreciate that comment, but also to know that everyone's working really hard to figure out how we can fill the gaps should we not get money from the state.
And I just want to be clear on that, like what the point Ryan was making about how we're pulling the data, because when we do close a shelter, we are relocating those people, right? So that data point, that all those, like whether it's a Peninsula or perhaps Sunderland, like the data point gets pulled into it. Not that like we're throwing people out on the streets.
No, and I know, and I think we've seen in this body, we've seen 91% utilization rates, et cetera, and I've seen that work to relocate, but the capacity matters because it allows us and outreach workers and just as a community to have a more firm stance about limiting street-based camping because there are available units. And while I know no one gets thrown out, at the same time, it also limits capacity. And we set 1,000 deliberately. It was not by accident. And I think we pushed the limits in terms of what the county could achieve. And to see that backsliding by 128 was one thing, but by 40% would be a significant concern for me.
I appreciate that. I will say a lot of this, the 1,000 was part of like the joint city county work to set that strategy. And I think it served us well in setting the goals. I think bringing in some of the conversation around what is needed to have successful exits from shelter to support that system that we're trying to build as we're adding 1,000 beds is really important. And to Commissioner Singleton's point, I think the fact of looking at because we had over $70 million deficit for our homeless services department and are looking at across the system where those cuts are happening to make up those difference, the additional dollars that are available potentially in the system, whether it's from Metro or the state, are going to be really key to helping us stay on course for reaching the outcomes that we've set, whether it's shelter, whether it's moving people through shelter to housing successfully, whether it's moving people into housing or preventing homelessness. So, Mayor?
I just want to bring the political aspect to bear on this. So I was elected on November 5th or 6th, and it was 2 hours after the numbers were pretty set that I would be our next mayor. And Commissioner Maps called me up, and he said that they had the votes to move out of the IGA. And he asked me specifically what I thought. And I was very clear on the campaign that it is time to get this relationship to work. I'm committed to it. I had talked hundreds of times about the 1,000 bed commitment the county had made, that we need to provide shelter and address the suffering and those dying on the street. And I have said those words in this meeting dozens of times and on the campaign trail thousands of times. And I still stay committed that that was a promise that the HREP between the city and the county made to the public. I confirmed that. I talked about it. I rallied behind it. And I told Commissioner, no, I want it to go forward. We have to let this relationship work. He went back to Ryan Gonzalez and they shifted their votes to commit to this meeting. And I see a 40, I did not know about that. That's news to me. And I'm concerned. All I would say is let's partner together. Randy Westerman at Portland Solutions has been doing a great job coming from Mercy Corps, bringing in emergency crisis management. She is adding shelters and has a pipeline of shelters. If you don't have the money, then ask us for help. And we don't have to do a high cost 24/7 shelter, but we do have to provide the shelter beds. And so we have thousands of units. Let's decide. We don't have to have a one type. We need it all. So I would just simply say, let's work together and hit the 1,000 beds. I'm going to continue to talk about that.
I just want to, I completely appreciate that. And I, again, want to be really clear. I am not proposing closing shelters that have an ongoing lease. It is acknowledging that these shelters are already closing and switching out funds so that we can do our permanent supportive housing work, but using one-time only dollars to pay for the shelters that we know are closing. And so I do think it's critically important to know that this connection is 200 units of permanent supportive housing because these shelters are slated to already close. We don't have the ability to extend the lease. If we do, none of those types of programs were put on the list. So I just want to be really clear. It's just a high dollar amount because shelters are expensive. But I think the goal is to figure out to make sure those can stay funded through their lease end dates. And to figure out, okay, now how do we do this ongoing? Because again, I know this is not just about the budget, but I expect we'll have an additional reduction in SHS next year. And so we're going to have some really hard conversations. And it's part of why I was calling for us to make an intentional work plan between City Council and County Commission to really look at all the data, the costs that we were talking about, cost of shelter, positive exits, what does that look like? And what is the right mix for us of overnight only to motel and hotel to behavioral health? What is the right mix? What is the cost? And how are we being thoughtful about what the data tells us we should prioritize investments?
Yeah, and I certainly understand your challenge. We're in it every day as well.
So I am shaping that work plan that the commissioner is speaking to right now for sort of what does the next workroom or work group look like in terms of a community sheltering strategy. And it's probably going to be an investment recommendation out to y'all. So more to come on that. But back to this, I just want to be clear that we can't change the metric absent a vote. So we are going to report out in our next quarterly report some supplemental data. We're going to pull the data for measure 3 as we always have been. You can't change that on you. Like you can't secretly change how we're pulling the data. So that will stay the same, but we're going to supplement it with some additional data to better capture what is happening throughout the system. Measure 3 as originally designed is just too narrow. Is everybody cool with that? Okay. We are, if no further questions, then we're going to move on. And I just want to bridge back. Sorry, I don't mean to belabor this, but
I deeply respect the hard work that the city and the county are doing in your budgeting process. I think as a community member around this table, doing my best to track the decisions that you're making relative to this, but it would be really helpful as we have some more of these conversations as we gear up for HREP 2.0 to understand what the trade-offs are that you're considering relative to this plan, and to the extent that this body can be a helpful sounding board. that seems like a really good role. And I don't know about others that are not in it on a day-to-day basis, but tracking those specific implications to this is kind of tricky.
Yeah, I'd be happy to have that conversation with you around our budget, because there definitely have been trade-offs, especially with the huge swing in the number of dollars that are available from last year to this year.
I appreciate that. So Mayor, before I kicked it to you, just to bridge back to our time together last month, the Deputy Director of HSD was here. She shared some best practices around our shelters and how those best practices currently get incorporated into HSD contracts. So I want to remind you of that as grounding. And then sort of this is part of the HSD's data project work, right, was creating not just better external dashboards, which we now have and are live on the website, as you are well aware, but also better internal dashboards for contract management. So she showed you that future state of what that is going to look like. I believe the timing is this fall. So we are all anxiously awaiting that piece to be live. And then before, Mayor, I did want to provide an opportunity. You know, we just did a little teaser earlier on the overnight shelter beds in terms of where they are at in terms of data collection, still getting that technical assistance and guidance. But I just wanted to provide you or your staff, Sky or Brandy, just a moment to talk about the utilization very quickly and where y'all are at with perhaps expansion, to just report out the district because it's haven't heard it yet.
Brandy, you want?
Sure.
I think we can do this relatively quickly because you have the slide in front of you. So I'm Brandy Westerman. I'm the Humanitarian Operations Director, so I just lead the shelter services. So the two overnight shelters that we've kind of opened now for several months, you can see the utilization data. This is average month-to-month utilization at the two sites. And as a reminder, the first site, the safe site, is in Southwest Portland. That serves women identifying folks. You can see that in March and April, we had quite high utilizations rates. Those dropped a little bit in May. The second column is the Moore Street site that is in North Portland. And that serves people of all gender or adults of all gender. And again, you can kind of see a slight drop, but overall, we're seeing a pretty high utilization rate of those cumulative 200 beds. We're close to opening an additional 380 beds in various locations across the city. So we'll see additional overnight shelter options coming in.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Brandy.
All right. Mayor.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a continuing conversation, and I had noted the shelter guidelines last month. So what I want to do is really start focusing our conversation on harmonizing our contracts. And she had noted that the shelter best practices from the HSD shelters required all HSD contracts to follow those processes. So I want to just level set with that as our framing. Next slide. Thank you, Joanne. And as I did last month, when I talked to you about some of the calls I get in the morning and I get my security assessments, last month was a woman being found in a tent with just only her bones after 4 months of being there. What I get now and what you're getting in the newspapers is we have babies being born and that are dying in tents. And I always want to level set so you understand what the calls I'm getting on a daily basis. And there's been 4 of these incidents since February of this year, 2 in April alone. And then I want to level set and understand why the sense of urgency. And I know you all have it. The governor declared a homelessness emergency in 2023. The city reaffirmed our homelessness and housing emergency in 2024. I work with our counselors and I hand them that declaration. And I always want everybody to know that I'm not working as a personal approach. I'm working as a mandate through previous commissioners and counselors and the governor for us. And I want everybody to know that we can't look in the mirror and say, yes, we are treating this like an emergency. And I appreciate Brandy, 380 units coming on. She understands that urgency in every meeting that I have every Monday. in our incident command meeting about the need that we have to address, and the team is doing well. Did the organization that handed these women their tents and tarps help them, or did they perpetuate the suffering? Portland must end unsheltered homelessness and provide a clean, safe bed for every person every night. We must also move those people upwards through the housing continuum while also maintaining an expectation of shelter for those who experience setbacks. Next slide, please, Jillian. And I appreciate Anna bringing forward the 5 keys. It's something I've been aware of for years, and I've always been trying to work our strategy within that, trying not to change overall processes, trying to work within them. It's easier to create that flow. But with this, let's do a gut check on the set of best practices that we're in full agreement on from the National Alliance to End Homelessness. The first one is housing first approach. And the quote in there is, align shelter eligibility policies and practices so anyone experiencing homelessness can access shelter without prerequisites and make services voluntary and assist people to access permanent housing options. And so with that, I ask, can anyone experiencing homelessness in Portland access shelter? The answer is no, because we don't have enough emergency shelter beds. Together, we've realized that a tent is not a shelter and leads to worse outcomes, and we must end this practice, including among our service providers. Are services voluntary? Yes, but this doesn't prevent us from establishing engagement requirements, bed utilization, and stay limits, so within the expectations of these guidelines. Are we assisting people to access permanent housing? Yes. And we're even beating our original goals. As through SHS, we are far exceeding, but we need to focus on not the activity, but we have to focus on the outcome, what's happening on our streets. Number 2, safe and appropriate diversion. Quote, provide diversion services to find safe and appropriate housing alternatives to entering shelter through problem-solving conversations, identifying community support, and offering lighter touch solutions, end quote. We are missing opportunities here. Every point of contact should include the following questions. Quote, are you ready to go home? Is there a loved one we could connect you with? Quote, where were you last housed? Can we connect you with the services and housing resources there? We need to work together to clear barriers that prevent unification in housing, especially legal barriers like outstanding warrants and misdemeanors. Number 3, immediate and low barrier access. Quote, ensure immediate and easy access to shelter by lowering the barriers to entry and staying open 24/7. Eliminate sobriety and income requirements and other policies that make it difficult to enter shelter, stay in shelter, access housing, and income opportunities, end of quote. We cannot have immediate and easy access to shelters if we don't have enough beds. That's the problem I'm determined to solve. Not every person needs 24/7 shelter. And that best practice is interfering with our ability to save lives right now. Requiring reservations that take weeks, we don't have that. We don't have weeks when somebody is ready for shelter tonight. And we're requiring reservations today. Every door needs to be the right door when that person is ready. We're also not moving people through our 24/7 shelters quickly enough, which means they serve fewer people. 4, housing focused, rapid exit mindset. Quote, focus services and shelter on assisting people to access permanent housing options as quickly as possible, end quote. Jillian, I know we're going to talk about housing at the end of this and in future, and I look forward to explaining to you what the city is doing to focus and help this table with that. And 5, data and measure performance. Quote, measure data on a percentage of exits to housing, average length of stay in shelter, and return to homelessness to evaluate the effectiveness of the shelter and improve outcomes, end of quote. And I want to thank Anna and Ryan. I don't know if he's here. Ryan, great job on your data. really appreciate this last, the data drops you've given the last few weeks have been eye-opening. So you're really, and the system and partnership is really starting to produce great information for us to use. Appreciate that. That data is also telling us that we have to act and we have to act now. Next slide, please. This is what the city is doing. So I really want everybody to kind of know that we're not operating in a vacuum, but it's in parallel with what the SOC is doing and the HSD is doing as well. We have 178 days remaining in our goal to end unsheltered homelessness to make sure everybody in Portland who needs a bed has a bed when they're ready. The first item that we were focused on is to end tent distribution. And I'm grateful for the county's action on this, and I'd also like to set a standard that no service provider funded by this body or anybody based on contracts should distribute tents with or without funds that we are providing. I'll do my part by providing a better option, but we need to set a uniform expectation and standard across the city. And I'm happy to say that the tent counts that we're measuring in the ESD areas, the downtown core, are falling, and we're seeing that, which means that we must rapidly set up the 380 beds now so those individuals have a safe place to come into. 2, safe and appropriate diversion. We're working to set up diversion opportunities at every point of contact, every contact we have, every contact that police, the judges, PSR, our outreach workers, we're asking them the question, are you ready to go home? Is there a loved one we can contact you with? And if it's not local, we are getting people connected within hours, even if it's as far away as Brooklyn, Mississippi, or South Dakota. For folks with more complex needs and barriers, such as outstanding misdemeanors and warrants, we are setting up systems to clear those within hours. The DA stepped up to me on Wednesday and said, tell us what you need. If their connection can be made, we'll remove a misdemeanor or charge immediately. I talked to Tony Purnell, who handles the ticket home. He was amazed by that and said, we're in and we're going to connect with those systems. 3, shelter best practices with a focus on our rapid exit mindset. I just went through the shelter best practices, and I'll expand on that in the next part of this discussion. And 4, we're providing safe bed for every person every night. The city of Portland is committed to 1,500 beds to be online by December 1st. The county is committed to 1,000 by December 31st. We've also asked private suppliers to bring 500 on, and I'm happy to say that they're moving forward. And you see that with Blanchet House adding Bethany's room in a few months. That's 80, and 40 recovery bringing recovery beds on, and they're going to schedule for the last quarter of this year. Together, that means that we're providing a safe bed for every person every night if we move people through the system. And 5, reestablish community standards. We have to focus on caring for those that own businesses, ensuring that a corridor is not a toilet or a bedroom, and ensuring that somebody who's houseless can expect life-saving care at night, getting that community standard back to our community.
Mayor, I'm sorry, but we gotta move through these
Yeah,
faster.
this is my last. And housing strike team. We've convened an incident command meeting, not only for sheltering, but for housing. And I've asked Chair and Commissioner Singleton to participate, their time permitting, and I'm excited to using their expertise. I'm happy to say the next slide is good back to. This is the data that the HSD has provided, which is really important. Here's why we need a rapid exit mindset. In 2017, 93% of those in our shelter system exited within 90 days. Now it's 77%. In 2017, staying in a shelter a year or longer was essentially unheard of. Now we have hundreds. Next slide. Those bottlenecks have consequences. Every person stuck in the shelter system denies a bed to the person who needs it next. We've also gone from spending $40 million in 2017 to $400 million today. If you're worried that my plan warehouses people instead of moving them through the system, look at these numbers. We're already doing that. And it's time to unstick this system. I also want to make mention that this is the overall system with motel, alternative shelter. If we're looking at just congregate shelter, the 23 days in 2017, it's 54 days today for just the congregate shelter, which we're talking a lot about. Next slide. Well, really, this is the last slide. We turn the tide with a rapid exit mindset. And I want to acknowledge, Jillian had noted that that's a shelter best practice NAEH point, and I'm using it in more in a holistic, and I'm using it incorrectly, and I apologize. It's what I use at the city, though. Every contact we want is a rapid exit mindset to the next step, if possible. But it also may need and may mean a rapid exit mindset to a step below. If a person's not ready to engage, if they're not focused on becoming housing ready, if they're not focused on gaining their SSI or their license or things that are going to impact our ability to house them, we should be able to house everybody. It does mean a continuum, which is a flow system. So I want to be clear with everybody. We have to focus on engagement requirements, stay limits and bed utilization. We have to reduce and remove set-asides, which we know we have to focus on. If we have a bed, it can never be focused on being empty for something that may occur when we have thousands on the street. Emergencies are happening every night. And these are steps that are zero cost to the system. I'm not talking about one dime today in changing guidelines. How do you double the effectiveness of a single bed in our shelter system? Move someone through the system twice as fast. So I listed on this, and I'd like this to be a starting point. We don't have to have it here. Jillian, please cut the conversation off as necessary. This is not a quick discussion. It's an ongoing discussion that I want to bring to the table, that what we're doing in the city on our contracts. Our overnight shelters are walk-in. We will not deny somebody a room tonight. We will not require a reservation. But you have a 90-day stay limit, and you're guaranteed a bed the next night when you return. And we will refer you to connection the next day, whether it's a treatment, referral, whatever the case may be. And we'll allow you to reapply if you've expired that 90 days in 45 days, come back. But we will have another shelter. We want to make sure you're moving through the system. You're engaging. You're part of this success story. If it's a 24/7 shelter, which we have many of at Portland, Brandy is setting up the contract that a reservation still required. Our coordinated access system, we will use it. 90 days. Happy to talk about our system merging what you want. I've talked to Tony and others, and I'm spitballing here, but I'm happy to have an open conversation. But the bed has to be utilized, and we recognize there's bereavement. There are issues that may not require you to be there all 30 days in a month. We recognize that. Grace without waste is what I've heard from service providers. Engagement is required. We have to help you through. Yes, it's a trauma-informed situation. If you have somebody who's suffering from behavioral health and they get to the 90th day, but they're moving into the system, absolutely has to be trauma-informed. Work with the individual who needs the help on what they need, but years have to be reduced to days, and then 45 days to reapply. And then the bottom line is what our contracts are applying in our current shelter system. We just want a conversation. If we can merge and marry up a system with what we're providing, we have a more effective system to help change those behaviors. That's really in a nutshell. And you can provide your input, but it's an ongoing conversation I want to have. Brandy has put forward a punch list and diversion. At your birthday entry, we're very clear. Can we connect you with a loved one? We don't care if it's local. We don't care where it is. We want to connect you. And we ask that question in a successive manner over and over again, helping a person through the process, making sure that they're engaging to help them with that next step, which we do not want people in shelter. I want everybody to know we never want people in shelter over a year. Absolutely not. We want them in days, and then we'll focus on the incident command for the housing strike team to start unlocking available housing in our community. And I assure you, Portland has a lot of help we can do that.
I'm going to play the part of Jillian and say, I really want us to talk about the housing conversation, and we only have 30 minutes. So I don't know if there's particular feedback you're
Just
looking
got the
for.
hook.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I agree. It is a twin conversation. I appreciate that, Commissioner.
Yeah, and I appreciate, thank you for sharing your slides and the data and starting this conversation. It is going to take more time than we have today to really delve in, but folks can reflect on it, and we can start having those conversations in subsequent meetings. I am we know that shelter, has spent a lot of time, I think, talking about shelter in these meetings. I'm very excited to be moving and talking about housing, because whether we're talking about the dollars that are needed to get somebody from shelter or on the street to housing, you have to have places for people to go. And we know that there's a lot of changes happening at the federal level. There's a lot of work happening locally. So I want to thank Ivory for talking a little bit today. And I know we have Josh from the city of Portland. So I think we're ready to.
Ivory will be first.
Okay, great.
Okay,
All right,
thank
good.
you. And I'll try to be as quick as possible. So just want to provide you some updates. I'm Ivory Matthews, CEO for Home Forward, one of our 20+ housing authorities in the state of Oregon. I want to provide you some updates with respects to how the executive orders have trickled down and impacted our work around affordable housing. Some of you may or may not know, we're not a federal entity, but 85–90% of our dollars comes directly from the federal government through congressional appropriations each year. And so when executive orders are applied to the housing and urban development, they do impact us. I want to first talk about the HUD staff in our field office. HUD is projected to lose roughly, based on the executive orders, HUD is projected to lose roughly 50%, and staffing resulting in anticipated delays in funding, disbursements, reduced oversight and processing of necessary compliance requirements such as environmental reviews, which is super important to how we continue to preserve and build more affordable units. The Portland office, field office was slated for closure, but due to coordinated advocacy, and I want to thank many of you in this room for that coordinated advocacy effort, the office will stay open. They have, however, they've seen many staff take the fork in the road kind of offer and are no longer there. So, but staff still continues to support housing authorities, and the continuum of care has been significantly reduced. And so we do have less staff there, but are in constant communications with our field office. Want to talk next about the mixed status households. Currently under HUD's current rules, federally funded affordable housing can assist households that have mixed immigration status, but we must prorate the amount of assistance to cover only eligible household members. And so how we do that, Home Forward as a moving to work agency, which we have a special designation by HUD to make those provisions. We take, our current practice is to do our standard rent and rent assistance calculation for the number of total household members, and then charge $1 for each ineligible household member. However, due to the executive orders at the end of March, Home Forward and other impacted moving to work agencies around the country were notified by HUD that we must develop a plan to cease all alternative prorations. And so we're currently in conversations with HUD on how we unwind the alternative prorations. And we're also proposing a timeline as far out as reasonable for implementation and awaiting guidance from HUD on what they will accept. Under Home Forward's proposed timeline, new prorations would be applied to impacted families at their next recertification, which gives us a little bit of time that, trying to reduce as much impact as possible to those families. And so our recertification based on the household, we do them every 3 years or as household income changes. So that does buy a little bit of time for those impacted families. The future potential impact, we have been notified by staff at HUD that a proposed administrative rule is forthcoming that would make it unlawful to have mixed immigration status households residing in federally assisted housings. So we're unsure of the timing, but we will continue to prepare to launch an advocacy effort with many of you in this room and just our colleagues around the country to make sure that we have our say in rulemaking and how it impacts our families. Our current response is we've identified in our entire housing portfolio, we currently serve a little over 18,000 families. But we've identified 300 households who meet this status, and in those households, there are 900 children. And they live in a combination of our mixed rental market housing through our HCV, Housing Choice Voucher Program. Some of them live in also our low-income housing tax credit programs. So if implemented today, the standard HUD proration would force our mixed households to pay $2.6 million more each year and collectively in rent. And developing a prioritization index of families most impacted for these changes has been our highest priority to try and, protect those families with the highest vulnerabilities. We are also exploring an alternative method to provide ongoing assistance to families at the same or lesser level, including swapping other non-federally funded resources, such as right now, those families are being funded by federal dollars, and we're looking at how we might have been in conversations with many of you in this room with our regional long-term rental assistance program, and also looking at the Oregon long-term rent assistance voucher program to see if we can make a swap with those families to reduce the impact as well. Developing engagement strategy with impacted families. We're also developing an engagement strategy with impacted families to notify them of future changes and in conversations with culturally specific providers to inform them of our engagement strategy. These conversations continue to go on a regular basis. Next biggest impact that we have is with the Emergency Housing Voucher Program. The Emergency Housing Voucher Program was a program that HUD implemented in 2021, and this was a part of the American Rescue Plan. And it was an efforts to move families who were homeless off of the streets and into housing, into stable housing. And it was expanded. It was expected that the program would be funded through 2030. However, HUD has notified us that housing authorities, the funding will end in 2026. So specific dates of 2026 vary depending on the housing authorities, but for us, we anticipate funding right now. Based on our last correspondence, that funding will end in November of 2026. So this Emergency Housing Voucher Program has helped us successfully through partnerships in this room, house 436 households. So in comparison, the Housing Choice Voucher Program and the EHV households have lower incomes and are larger in size. And so what we're exploring now is we're exploring to take those 436 households and transition those households over to, as much as possible, absorb them into our regular voucher program. As with everything else that we're getting through executive orders on a daily basis, HUD guidance on this topic is also forthcoming. And there are some emergency housing voucher households who are also a part of the mixed immigration status households that we are working on another solution to see how we can house those families as well. So in conclusion, federal funding concerns. So here are just kind of a quick overview of what's happening right now with the budget concerns. We do know now that congressional negotiations are still happening. And here are some proposals that currently exist in the current budget. And that is a reduction in state rental assistance block grants. Moving programs, there's a proposal to move programs to a state-based formula grant. There is also a proposal to have a 2-year cap on rental assistance for able-bodied adults. And what we understand, able-bodied meaning those individuals who are not disabled, who are not elderly, meaning 55 or older, and those individuals who have children under the age of 6. Also ensuring the majority of rental assistance is provided to older adults and people with disabilities. That's one of the biggest pushes in there. And also, we have seen a $26 billion decrease in public housing, tenant-based rental assistance programs, project-based rental assistance, housing for elderly, and housing for people with disabilities. There is also a proposal to eliminate home and CDBG funds, eliminate family self-sufficiency programs, eliminate fair housing initiative programs that funds many state-focused fair housing councils. So in closing, we are tracking the congressional budget and are in communications with all of our congressional officials. And we also work very closely with our trade organizations and advocating on a regular basis. And many times we are in DC on a regular basis on Capitol Hill, talking to our members and also talking to not just our members here in Oregon, but also talking to our colleagues across the country so that they can advocate too as well.
Avery, if you don't mind, so that is a whole hell of a lot more than I've been able to capture in the national news. I would love all of that in writing and to distribute it to this group, and in particular, the director of PHB, and then also Anna Plum, who will soon be taking over, because am I correct to assume that if the gymnastics you are trying to do for these hundreds of families does not work out, they will become homeless? Is that the bottom line?
That's worst case scenario.
That's worst case scenario.
Absolutely.
Okay, all right. I will leave it to the rest of the group to ask.
I will say this too. We have been convening a regular monthly meeting with all of our partners who are impacted by federal decisions. And so all of what I've shared with you, all of our partners, PHB, the county, Metro, OHCS, all of our partners, and I'm sure I'm missing somebody, but all of our partners are aware of how these decisions are impacting Home Forward and the families that receive federal assistance through these programs.
Thank you.
That's really great to hear, because it's going to absolutely take coordination from all of us to figure out how to best manage through what's happening right now. So thank you.
You're carrying, that's a lot to carry. I just want to acknowledge that, like just whatever we can do to support, and I would love to know how we can be helpful. I think it's a paperwork nightmare. Like the way you talk about it, it's like, oh, that should be very easy, but we know it's not. And so I just think we have to think about, if we need to provide staffing support, how are we have experts who do this all the time, and they may need to not focus on new housing placements for a month to really focus on how to make this happen. I don't know, but I just want us to be open to how do we try to ensure we don't have more folks fall into homelessness because of this. And I just want to also name that CDBG funds in the state go to a lot of the infrastructure that then supports housing development. So that has even wider implications than just currently supporting households in housing. It's the development impact is big.
Yeah. And may I just say, Commissioner Stone, thank you for pointing out the real heaviness. I'll only spend a few words. I can't imagine what your mind's going through on a daily basis, and the 3 a.m. cold sweats you're coming in. But thank you for what you're doing on behalf of, I think I speak on behalf of County and Portland. Thank you for showing up. We need you now more than ever.
Thank you. Well, I'm up at 6 a.m. a lot of mornings with calls that are happening on the East Coast. I don't care. Like, I'm up. I might not be on camera, but I'm up.
Thank you, Avery. We appreciate you.
We're now ready to hand it off to Josh. He's here with us from the Portland Housing Bureau.
Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thanks for having me. I'm Josh Roper. I'm the Policy and Planning Director for the Portland Housing Bureau. I'm going to try to get through this pretty quickly, but basically this is a presentation that kind of stems from Goal 6 and is PHB's kind of thinking about what we've been up to since creation of these bonds, the Portland and Metro bonds, through to today, and what we're kind of planning at a high level, some of the highlights of they're coming up. So like I said, I'll talk a little bit about the bonds. I'll get into affordable housing production history and the upcoming forecast, which is the doom and gloom piece of this, unfortunately. Some lessons learned from that bond deployment process over the last 9 years. And then moving forward, a couple of next steps, a few next steps. So,
The slides if you needed.
oh, we're still here.
Oh.
Okay, yeah, thanks. So finding more funds, very obvious, and this is something that overlaps with HRAP, overlaps with the housing production strategy, other planning processes that are happening. Driving down the cost of new housing, I'll flag one strategy we're working on that front, but there are more than that. Aligning homelessness outflow and housing strategy. Again, I'll highlight one strategy that we're considering at PHB to try to move in that direction. And then studying and implementing new housing models, some planning processes that are getting underway in coordination with City Council. Real quick, you may have seen this already. This is our little scorecard graphic around the Portland and Metro housing bonds and the successes that have resulted from those bonds. PHB and the City of Portland have exceeded goals, Metro support. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially we're ahead of where we expected to be on this front. That said, it doesn't meet the need and the bond funds are running out. So it's the presentation to address that. And then this is the annual affordable housing production history and a little bit of forecast. So a couple of things I want to note here. The dark blue at the bottom, I'll go bottom to top. Dark blue at the bottom is the bulk of what those bonds funded. That's your typical high-tech projects, affordable rental, subsidized affordable rental. The lighter blue is inclusionary affordable housing units. And that's the product of our mandatory inclusionary housing program. So buildings that are 20+ units, portion of those units required to be inclusionary housing, affordable units. So that's what's reflected there. Then you get to the darker peach color. And those are subsidized affordable home ownership units, smaller slice there. And that's mostly neighborhood housing preservation work within the Housing Bureau. So for example, down payment assistance loans. The last slice here, the top, the light peach. I just want to note, you'll see a little bit of an increase here, pretty significant increase actually, starting in 2021. It's not called out, but this is one of the success stories of the last 5 or so years. This is when the residential infill project got rolling. And you'll see in combination with those homeownership incentives that PHB administers, the residential inflow changes have created a bump in the housing production, which is great. So a couple of lessons we've learned over this last 9 years, right? One, I think everybody knows this, we need deeper affordability. And that is for a variety of reasons, but one that has been, I think, less obvious that folks have started to raise up here and elsewhere. The way that incomes kind of work here and the significant disparity between renter income and homeowner income, you're seeing a real pressure that's creating a market rent that's actually close to 60% of AMI, which is what a lot of affordable units are set at, right? So you end up with a decent inventory of 60% AMI units that require recertification for income, and they're not giving you a substantial enough discount from market to justify that added administrative burden. So it's something we really need to grapple with. It's something we're thinking about how to address going forward. And some of that has to do with more money and deepening the affordability that way. So there are some Metro bond interest proceeds that are coming back to the city that we may be able to use to deepen some of this affordability. But there are other strategies that are forward-looking that we really need to dig into as well. Okay, so another lesson learned, really the essential, how essential preservation is in addition to production. Part of the reason that I talk about this as expanding affordable housing inventory rather than just increasing production is because if we increase production and then lose affordable as a result of not investing in preservation, we're not gonna win this game, or we're not gonna succeed. So we kind of have to do both and make sure that we're balancing our spending in the production bucket and the preservation bucket. This is becoming more acute because construction costs, repair costs, maintenance costs, insurance costs are all skyrocketing. We've got significant security concerns in some units that have been raised by project managers, developers as well, as they try to get loans. We've deployed a safety and security grant program, which I think is a good concrete intervention, deployed about $2 million to projects that were struggling a little bit on the security front. They've been very appreciative for that support. We have what we're calling lender roundtables, where we convene lenders, talk to them about what they're running into in terms of issues. And some of these, both problems and solutions have surfaced from those conversations. So we're trying to get Portland a better there's some other work happening here, Coalition to Restructure Debt and Struggling Properties, that we're looking into, making sure we are quantifying the preservation funding needs, explicitly assessing housing provider stability, trying to get ahead of this issue rather than letting providers fail and then trying to clean up the mess after the fact, exploring opportunities for property management improvements, and also trying to align vacancies with PSH options to the extent that that's possible. Okay, so what's next? This is one piece. This is kind of the remaining HRAP Goal 6 thing, the action item from Goal 6 that's still here. And it overlaps with the Housing Production Strategy 2, which is a large document that we spend quite a bit of time talking about and with full BPS in, so that's always an option for this group. But the idea here is pretty straightforward. We need more money. One way that we will get more money is through the new TIF districts. So there are 6 new TIF districts that are launching, 3 in Central City, 3 in East Portland. Those are going to generate about $1.1 billion over 30 years collectively, which is a significant amount of money, but unfortunately not enough. But that's very important. In about 5 years, we'll be able to start bonding on that revenue, that TIF revenue, which is when the real development action will start. Most likely, or we'll be able to sort of start launching deals, negotiating deals. Another kind of open question is SHS funds for capital needs. It's a big question mark in my mind, and a new housing bond. And I just want to flag, the Housing Bureau received, well, the Housing Bureau was awarded a $7 million grant from HUD, the HUD Pro Housing Grant, and a small piece of that is $300,000 dedicated to essentially telling the story of the successes of the bonds and the need for affordable housing going forward, kind of life-changing impact of affordable housing production in Portland to help to tee up appetite for a new bond down the road that becomes possible. And there are many other chunks of work that will come out of that. So another, what's next? Strategic acquisition. So you may have heard a fair bit about this. The market right now is kind of a good place for acquisition to be a good option when you compare it to new development. So right now, we're trying to move on those opportunities that make sense. It's not always the cleanest math. Sometimes an acquisition, it's harder to underwrite, but particularly occupied acquisitions where you've got cash flow from essentially day one have some real promise. So that's encouraging. We've got to keep in mind, right, that acquisition versus new production, we aren't necessarily increasing the overall housing inventories consideration that we're talking acquisition. Okay, another thing that's interesting, so this is coming out of Community Solutions. It's the Large Cities Acquisition Fund. It's related to acquisitions. And it's a model that Community Solutions has developed that is really intended to align homelessness outflow, shelter exits, and a housing strategy through, in this case, this particular fund. And it involves patient equity investors, so essentially folks who are willing to wait for their money a little bit longer and have a kind of lower return than you would typically find in the market. It's an acquisition strategy, like I mentioned. It involves an enhanced property management model. And the idea is, you can acquire occupied units, you can align those units with shelter exits upon turnover. So it's not like you have to have all of your shelter exits ready to go as soon as you acquire this property. It's kind of a longer term strategy that acknowledges that you can't do it all on day one. The model is that you hold, or the fund holds the property for 10 years. And then during that period, you're able to kind of stabilize and make sure it's working. And then you dispose to a mission aligned nonprofit type organization. You become the owner and the long-term operator. Okay, and some planning stuff that's happening. Excuse me. So we are really excited at the Housing Bureau about the social housing planning that is really just starting. We got directed by City Council to do this study, and it's going to be due by the end of May of next year. The basic idea is to study models that exist internationally, particularly Vienna, social housing models, domestic ones as well. And that includes these sort of alternative ownership, management, and financing models, really focusing on sustainable funding, permanent affordability, and try to figure out how to adapt them to Portland, how to make them make sense here. That includes looking at underwriting. It includes looking at the kind of legal contours of adapting these models to Portland's unique situation. And we'll come out with some policy and programmatic recommendations by the end of that process. The last thing I want to mention is this unified housing strategy that Council is getting started with. And I only mention it because it's another opportunity for us to align the various plans that exist in this space. It's really a kind of city-focused effort from what I understand, but ultimately I think could lead to improved coordination across jurisdictions. So I'm excited about that, coordinating with the HRAP, coordinating with the housing production strategy, the social housing planning, other planning processes that are happening. So it's exciting, challenging environment.
Thank you, Josh, so much for that.
Chair, let me say up front, this conversation will continue into July. I assume everybody wants that. There is a ton here. And we haven't even talked about metro and regional planning, or maybe pulling in the state to talk about the ORCA process and how that's going. Anything in these slides we could go deeper on. So I will send these out, but I need either direction right now and sort of how you want to dig deeper on housing production in particular next time, because it's a lot. And we could literally spend the next 3 meetings just digging into any of these things.
I'd love to have, when you send these out, if we could get the pipeline for 0 to 30 and 0 to 60 disaggregated, that would be helpful to know. I know some of the pipeline goes a little bit higher, but I think those are the 2 that touch this population.
Yep.
I think it's really important to say thank you, like, again, Josh, for this. I think talking about like what's in the plan. I know the state has pushed local jurisdictions to develop housing strategy plans. So like getting reports out on those, how those are going for Metro, for the city, any efforts on that. So we know what potentially the need is, like the assessment, the need is. And I think that, for me looking at this, it's the fact that like the TIF districts are going to be helpful, maybe starting in 5 years, but for right now, we really don't have any short-term responses or short-term capacity. And we've heard that the federal, we shouldn't be expecting the feds to come in with this. So I love the idea of the social impact financing models. I think that's an exciting creative thing. So I think just like setting up a conversation so we know what the need is, what the assessment is, what current plans are, and then some of these creative ways that we could be focusing on things.
The other thing, we could spend all 2 hours in July talking about housing production strategy stuff. Mindy, the other thing I was thinking about, depending on what happens in Salem, is just sort of a behavioral health piece update. If any portion of the governor's $90 million investment in more beds, all types of beds. I didn't know. You and I can talk, but if there's space for that, if there's interest in sort of the behavioral health bed expansion piece, which we all know is a great need, we can get a debrief out of like Salem Sine Dies, if that's of interest.
Space for us to actually talk. This felt really presentation heavy today. And I know that it's always a struggle to balance, but I feel like there was stuff to talk about in each section that we just didn't have space for.
So solely housing production next time?
Let's make sure we talk.
I'm fine with the behavioral health, but let's get one, if we got materials ahead of time, we might not need to walk through every slide in the same way. And let's really be thoughtful about keeping the slides to a minimum.
Well, we have more time between this meeting and next, so I hear you, I get the feedback, I understand it. I agree, and we can do that.
And then let's keep the conversation on shelter guidelines. That's immediate life-saving care. So even if it's 15 minutes or so, we could just have what a guideline would look like. I agree with you, Commissioner. I'd rather have a robust conversation than a presentation next time. So we can gather opinions and see how we can start harmonizing our goals to really address the suffering on the street tonight. So.
Well, then what I will do, I'll get a commitment from folks who are pulling together materials. I'll send out some follow-up immediately after this meeting, but maybe 2 weeks out from July 18th, which is our next one. So we have more time now between this one and our next meeting to get you to digest some information in advance and maybe keep things to 2 or 3 slides and just leave it open.
Yeah, having the materials ahead of time is super helpful. Yeah, so even like the Monday before, I mean, the Monday, a week and a Monday before, I just think 14 days before is July 4th, so I don't think you're gonna be sending that.
Yeah.
Yes,
But
I think
that
time
all
is great.
involved really do try, and it's just, budget season has not been helpful with anyone's time.
No, it does eat up a lot of. So thanks, everyone. I just want to thank everyone for the information today, for being here. Just appreciate all the staff work of getting us, able to have these meetings and these presentations. Thank you for sharing the perspective on what's happening going forward. All of this work is important. And it shows that, I think, especially as we're going over some of these metrics and talking about HRAP 2.0, it shows like we are continuously trying to learn, use our data, figure out where our gaps are, and update our plans and our strategies so that we truly are working together to address the homelessness crisis. So thank you, Mayor. I appreciate the continued discussion on shelters, and we will continue to partner on all the work that we need to do around affordable housing. So thank you, Josh, for that as well. Our next meeting, as Jillian said, is Friday, July 18th, 9:30 to 11:30. We will be deciding on the location. Dan's already left, but just want to wish him a happy retirement. He's already up to work.
That's why I didn't email. Today. So his email's like, I retired. Like,
Thanks, everyone. Happy.